Hello everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Daniel Gormali, welcome back, and my channel is called Hometown Chess Hero, don't know why. Anyway, today I'm going to review a chess book called The Rise and Fall of David Bronstein by Genna Sosonko. Hang on. Some alarms going, I'm going to turn the alarm off. So this is by Genna Sosonko. It's about this chess player called David Bronstein. Now, who was David Bronstein? People familiar with chess history would have been aware that David Bronstein was a Soviet grandmaster. I believe he was born in Ukraine, and he came to prominence in the 1940s and 1950s. He played a world championship match against Mikhail Botvinnik, the legendary Mikhail Botvinnik. Now, the book is by Genna Sosonko. It has an interesting title, The Rise and Fall of David Bronstein, which rather suggests that there's, rise to prominence and then a fall. So what's the book about? So it's obviously about Bronstein. So let me talk a little bit about the book. So Genna Sosonko is, I think, also a Soviet grandmaster originally. I'm not sure, was he Russian, or I'm not sure exactly what country he was from, but he was an emigre from the Soviet Union. And I believe that now he's currently living in the Netherlands. I can't be certain. I played a tournament in Ghent a couple of years ago, and he was the guest commentator. Very strong player in his own right. Also a great writer. Garry Kasparov at the back says Sosonko is clearly the top chess writer around. I'd say the only one who compares to him would be his friend Jan Timman. I love Jan Timman's annotations. Obviously, there are a lot of very good chess writers around. Garry Kasparov would be one. Himself tends to be that some of the best chess players are also the best writers. But Genna Sosonko, what you're getting when you buy one of his books is this kind of literary content to the book. So that kind of stands it aside. You feel like you're reading a book of a famous novelist, not just a great chess writer. So it's not just a good writer, not just a good chess writer, it's just a good writer, full stop. So the interesting thing about this book is it really discusses this very interesting figure, David Bronstein, who clearly comes across as hugely flawed during the course of the book. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about David Bronstein, because I'm lucky enough I actually met David Bronstein. He was friends with Peter and Rosemary Hannon, who were based at Charlton Chess Club. So when I grew up, Charlton Chess Club was my local club. That's when I would go on a Thursday and Tuesday and Thursday night. It was based in Charlton House, which is a famous Tudor building in South East London, near Charlton Village. David Bronstein would turn up. It's like, wow, this guy's like a legend, and I'm meeting him down a local club. This is crazy, right? It's like one of these famous, it's like Bobby Fischer turning up, or, Capablanca. Maybe not quite at that caliber, but, similar, right? I was lucky enough to play him at Blitz. And as he explains in the book, he was a very good Blitz player. I lost 5-1. And he was just, it just felt like a different level. It felt like a world championship level. Just you knew where the pieces belonged. It just felt like a higher level. And I was probably mid-teens at that time, sort of 16, 17. And David would have been in his early 70s, possibly. Now, he also played for our club. And I was the captain once, this is a little bit later, in a London League match. And I remember him playing against Malcolm Payne on board one. I think it was some kind of Grunfeld defence. I think David was black in that game, but I can't really remember. I think it was a Rooksy. It was one of these trendy Rooksy 1 Grunfelds where white goes at an early H4. Very trendy at that time, like Shirov played it a lot. And David won on board one. But I lost the same match to David Friedgood. And when we were walking back to the car, so Alan Hanrett was driving us. And Alan always used to say you can only take David in small doses, which kind of talks about in the book as well. That he would sort of talk a lot, he's on to you all the time. But he actually just suddenly went into this fit of anger and said, "Why you play so quickly?" to me, right? And I became quite angry at that point, and I didn't really say anything, but I remember thinking, well, what's he doing talking to me like that, and obviously I respect him, but this is just ridiculous, right? But thinking about it now, he was actually the only one to hit on my primary weakness, which is playing too quickly, and it's something that I've never quite fixed. During the course of this book, he also mentions that he says that quite a lot, though. He says that to Dvoretsky, who you wouldn't think would be somebody who would play too quickly or too superficially. And it's also explained that he's slightly hypocritical when he makes these kind of statements, because often he would play too quickly himself. Now, there were a couple of things, that I wrote down during the course of reading the book. And I want to explain some of the notes that I wrote down. So it mentions during the course of the book that Bronstein was obsessed with losing the match to Botvinnik. I must admit, I didn't spend as much time, obviously, talking to Bronstein as Sosonko did. I didn't really get that impression he was obsessed with Botvinnik. Although I do recall at some point him saying that Botvinnik wasn't a very nice guy. Was obsessed with what Botvinnik thought of him. Was this true? So it talks a lot during the course of the book. Really, the heart of the book is really talking about what the author suggests is partly Bronstein's bitterness at not gaining the World Championship, given he was so close. And he talks all the time about how he should have won it. And I think it's a fair point to say that Botvinnik himself was a great player. And he must have felt slightly insulted to constantly, Bronstein constantly bring this up, that he should have won that world title. You would feel slightly insulted. And it mentions that Kramnik analysed that match, and it mentions during the course of the book that Kramnik analysed that match and he thought that Botvinnik was a worthy winner. So, you obviously Bronstein had a huge potential. That's what I said. I think he had huge potential. Possibly didn't make as much of it as he could have done. He had a huge, natural ability was off the scale. Probably as high as pretty much any world champion, bar maybe 2 or 3. He had as much talent as anyone. And although it was anti-computers, had this almost Leela style of play, so this sacrificial style of play. When you see Leela now, it can win from any kind of material down. David was a little bit like that as well. Fischer random freestyle was invented by Bronstein. So when people go on a lot now about freestyle, Bronstein was one of the first people, if not the first, to think about, to bring up this concept or bring this concept. Fischer then adopted his ideas and turned it into his own. And that's also true of the increment clock as well. Jealous of Tau, he also came up with a statement, 2 times 2 doesn't always equal 4, which normally attributed to Tau. But I'm giving away a lot of the book with all this. But what I wanted to talk about was, some of the descriptions of Bronstein, in my opinion, it's a little bit, you could describe it as a hatchet job. I don't think that's the author's intention. He's really trying to delve very deeply into the personality of Bronstein, which in itself makes it a fascinating book, in my opinion. He talks a lot about Bronstein's personality, about why he makes these statements, that he describes him as a restless neurotic. It's fascinating to read not only what the author thinks about Bronstein, but there's also a lot of, probably the most interesting parts of the book, funny enough, are when you see the comments by Bronstein himself, because it really gets into nitty gritty of what it's like to be a top chess player, particularly when he talks about someone like Botvinnik and some of his other contemporaries. He says, I'll just randomly opened a page. It says, his play is too rigid, although he is as cunning as Peter Romanovsky. Again, about himself, I played disgracefully, poor preparation. I rejected the French defence like an idiot. Used up tons of time and messed about with every move. There's also a picture of him playing against Botvinnik in 1951. That would have been the World Championship match. As you could see, that David lost his hair a lot, so he's kind of bald from an early age. Not sure why. Maybe just had, what's that called when you lose your hair? But because of that, if you look at the photo, just hold it up to the camera, the photograph on that page, you would say that actually, if you didn't know any better, you would say that Botvinnik was younger, even though I think he was about 13 or 14 years older than Bronstein. I think Bronstein would have been maybe about 26, 27. And at that point, Botvinnik would have been late 30s, like 39, maybe even 40 in that 1951 match. So fascinating. Obviously, a fascinating period of chess history. Let's just see any other notes that I've written down. And anything else worth mentioning as far as review is concerned. Puts Botvinnik down to elevate himself. So Botvinnik is described in the book as almost like this cold figure. He's indifferent to other chess players. He doesn't really socialise. So in a way, he's like the Steve Davis of Soviet chess. Steve Davis was famous for sort of snooker player, for blanking the other players, and that would kind of create this kind of competitive sort of fear of Davis, because you couldn't really sort of like get behind the curtain. And later on, Stephen Hendry used that. Tiger Woods used that. This coldness, If you're doing well against somebody, you don't talk to them. You don't want them to penetrate your inner shield and become friends with you. So maybe that was Botvinnik's intention. I think that's also why he didn't play much through like a period of his career, because I think he felt that this was create this kind of like, image of this indomitable figure, this unconquerable figure. But if he played in these tournaments and people beat him, then they would lose his fear of him. And probably Botvinnik was quite a paranoid person. And then they would play him, and they would potentially lose to, they potentially might beat him in a match, I should say. So Botvinnik, he was a bit of a cold fish in some ways, I suppose. But, that is what it is. You just have to accept it for what it is and just get on with your own thing. But unfortunately, according to what's said in the book, Bronstein didn't do this. In my opinion, Bronstein is slightly unfairly treated during the course of the book. I would say this is a great book. You should buy this book because it is a fascinating book. It's published by Elkham Ruby. It's a fascinating book. But I would say that he's slightly unfairly treated. Although it's also an accurate portrait, because so he's not unfairly treated because it's probably an accurate portrait. But he did have this kind of hyper intensity where he would rabbit on and about a lot of subjects. But what is stressed in the book is that he wasn't really an expert on anything other than chess, but he would talk a lot about other subjects, but a little bit like me, right? I talk about a lot. I often do random videos about 100 gorillas taking on one person, or was it one person, or 100 people taking on one gorilla, I should say, and claim to be an expert on that. And that's kind of the thing with Bronstein. Because he had a restless mind, he wanted to talk about all sorts of different subjects. But I do think that he was a fairly intelligent and insightful person. It doesn't really, anyway. So when you read this book, I think the main thing I should say, I'll try and sum up this review, because I do tend to I'm doing this Bronstein thing where I'm babbling on too long. When you read this book, it inspires you to read more about these characters, these personalities. I mentioned this before, that the characters now that you have in chess, it was a golden age back then. You didn't have computers, you didn't have AI, you didn't have, you didn't have this sort of like streaming and endless, preparation. Botvinnik was probably the first player to bring in this kind of professional, one of the first people to bring in this kind of professional preparation. But having said that, Bronstein still felt that chess was, getting towards its limits and was about to be solved. But I still think that there was more of a kind of a mystery to the game back in that period. And the personalities were far more interesting than the personalities we see in chess today. They were far more, they had to endure a lot more, so therefore they became more rounded. And that comes across in the book. So when you read this book about David Bronstein, here we see a picture of Genna Sosonko chatting to David. Quite a small guy, David. He's quite a small, sort of like Yoda-like figure. When you see him chatting, when you read about David and his life, it's a fascinating book in itself, and it also inspires you to buy these other books by Genna Sosonko, I think I've read another book. He also did one where he talked about some of these Russian emigres. You know, some of his descriptions are really good. And he talked about one guy who was like an alcoholic, and he was sort of like, you know, perfectly alkalized or something like that. His body was perfectly alkalized. Ivanov, who ended up in America. So he's got some great descriptions. But yeah, there's another book which I'm probably going to try and get, which is Evil Doer, about Korchnoi, who was just as fascinating figure as Bronstein, and very similar in a way, because he was also a great player who came very close to winning World Championship, but didn't quite do it. But you could argue that maybe if you put people who have not won the World Championship, the best players to never win the World Chess Championships, you'd probably put Korchnoi at the top. I know there's players around now. There's people like Caruana, but they're still going. But if we just talk about people's careers finished, I think Korchnoi would be right up the top, and I think Timon would be up there as well, because he was a great player for long periods, but he never quite managed to win the World Chess Championships. I even lost a FIDE version against Karpov. You'd look at those players, and you'd also mention Bronstein as well. Bronstein, certainly in the modern chess era, I think there were players even earlier than that, like Tarkatow, people like that. Tarash, Nimzovich, who never won the World Championships. But Bronstein would have been right up there as one of the best players to never won the World Championship. And that was kind of the tragedy of his life, which really the author talks about. So yeah, that's my review of this book. Please leave your comments down below. Do you agree with some of my comments? You know, I always got on pretty well with David, apart from that one incident where he kind of had his angry kind of strop at me. I always got on pretty well with, and I never found his sort of like, he would babble on a lot, but I never found it boring, because it was fascinating to sit there and talk to, you know, a player from that era that fascinated me at that time, and still does. You know, I was in my mid-teens. You know, I think I did try and talk to him about Fischer, because Fischer was really the character that fascinated me from that era. But it was still great to meet someone like David Bronstein, who had such great knowledge of chess. He was a very helpful guy. He was very nice to me, personally. And yeah, and he's also got like a foreword by Garry Kasparov, so that in itself is a selling point as well for the book. Yeah, leave your comments down below. What do you think of the book? Please, you know, help out this company, Elkham Ruby. I would say, you know, buy this book, because I would say this is like an 8 or 9 out of 10. I'm not sure if it's completely Sosonko's best book. You could even give it a 10 out of 10, to be honest. It's that good. But I think it's one of his best, and it's certainly one of the most fascinating subjects that he's brought to a chess book in David Bronstein. So The Rise and Fall of David Bronstein by Genna Sosonko, and you've got him there throwing darts at Botvinnik's head.